Alrighty, we're looking at human genetic disorders. What you're looking at there is you should recognize as a picture of sickle cell anemia. And so those are red blood cells that have been deformed by a mutation. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple of ways that errors happen in genetics, and one would be errors in meiosis. And so the creation of sex cells, some errors can happen in there, creating what's called non-disjunctions. And describing how small changes can really affect human traits. And so one of the chromosomal disorders that, one of many chromosomal disorders that happens is non-disjunction. Non-disjunction would be the separation of chromosomes. So non-disjunction means that the chromosomes are not separating during meiosis. And so when homologous chromosomes do not separate as they should, remember, homologous means the same. So you have a pair of chromosomes, chromosome number 23, for example, 22, 21. We're going to look at chromosome number 21 not separating and what that means. So then you end up with gametes with an abnormal number of chromosomes that may result. And so if you look at your slide here, and we should end up with a red and a yellow pair in each cell after this would be the last phases of, metaphase going into anaphase and then telophase. And so there we are in telophase with these cells that have an extra chromosome and some cells that have missing a chromosome. So you can have too many or too few. Most non-disjunctions do not go to term. So most of them never actually make it all the way to birth. So we have this non-disjunction happening in meiosis 1, and then ultimately in meiosis 2 we end up with that. So the most common one we study is trisomy 21, which involves 3 copies of chromosome 21 down there in the little red circle, and that we know as Down syndrome. So we have Down syndrome is quite a common disorder that affects individuals developmentally, and there's a spectrum of capabilities. And on the high end, they're able to live independently, hold down a job. On the low end, they'll suffer cognitive dysfunctions, and it can be a spectrum. It's not just one thing, but it definitely creates a whole bunch of physical problems also with heart development and so forth. There's also a non-disjunction of the X chromosome that leads to a disorder known as Turner syndrome. And then in males, so you end up with an extra X, and in males, non-disjunction may cause Klinefelter syndrome. So there's a couple of both end up having both psychological effects and physical characteristics to each of those. I have a family member that is one of my cousin's kids is Turner syndrome. And I've met some individuals that have Klinefelter syndrome. So those come with a host of physical and psychological changes also. So let's look at from molecular to phenotype, from molecule to phenotype. So the molecule, so when we have a change in DNA sequence of a gene, that can change the proteins. And so by altering that amino acid sequence, like when we looked at mutations, it can affect the phenotype. And so really common one that we're looking at is sickle cell anemia, and that's a recessive disorder. And so you have 3 phases of it's a incomplete dominant disorder. So if you have 2 genes that are normal, you have normal red blood cells. If you have 1 gene that's abnormal, you have some normal and some abnormal blood cells. And then if you have both, you have abnormal blood cells. So you're either you have normal hemoglobin, or you would have a 50% chance of having a offspring of a typical, cross would result in that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, with 25% of the offspring having sickle cell anemia also. Cystic fibrosis is also a one nucleotide change that changes the protein in it changes a protein that resides in the membrane of tissue that is smooth tissue that lines the lungs, esophagus, digestive tract. And that that is a chlorine ion channel. And when that chlorine ion channel is blocked or is dysfunctional in cystic fibrosis, that does not allow that chlorine to flow through the cell membranes, and it builds up on one side, creating a concentration gradient, creating a reaction within the body, which creates excessive mucus throughout the body. And so they are constantly coughing up this mucus. And so cystic fibrosis does not produce this normal CFTR gene, and protein doesn't work right. So they have respiratory problems lifelong. Got to tap on their back to be out to release some of the phlegm so they can breathe. They typically have shorter stature, whole variety of issues. Okay, so some of these disorders, one common one we study is that sickle cell anemia, and it can also have benefits. And so in certain areas of the world over time, being a carrier of sickle cell anemia provided you with resistance from malaria. And carrying one copy of the CF allele provides you protection from typhoid bacteria. So if you had sickle cell and you lived in an area where there was malaria, that would provide you with, you got to think you're growing up in an area where there's not a lot of resources or medicine or anything. So if you were born with normal blood hemoglobin, malaria basically would kill you when you were a kid. If you were born with sickle cell, then sickle cell disease would probably be fatal as a kid. But if you were born as a carrier, those carriers had an advantage and were able to live to reproductive age. And of course, the people that were of reproductive age were carriers. And so carrier and carriers typically ended up breeding. So you got a big H and a little h and a big H and a little h, and you cross that again, and then you end up with those same probabilities. So in a population, that trait persisted because environmental pressures were pushing on it, and it gave them a competitive advantage. And the same with the CF allele, when it provided a protection from the typhoid bacterium. So if you were a carrier for that, you didn't get as sick and die from typhoid. But if you got the cystic fibrosis, and that was a big problem. Otherwise, you didn't have it. And, if you're in an area where that causes that, that's a problem. So there's an evolutionary advantage in that in populations. All right, so that is an overview of those